Okay, and welcome back to Objective 4 of Week 7, Lecture 7 on International Strategy. This is a shorter objective, so I'm going to talk about Objective 4 in this session, and then I'm also going to talk about Objective 5. Objective 4 deals with the environmental trends affecting the choice of international strategies, particularly international corporate level strategies. I'd normally tack that on as part of the last set of slides, but as I'd already gone almost half an hour, I thought it would be better to give you a break in between and just deal with these two together. So, this is a broad statement of what's happening in the international environment and still reflects back some of the things I said in the introduction to the course. However, it adds to the week. However, it does add a couple of additional areas that I think are very important to understand. One of the reasons that firms enter markets is to deal with something called the liability of foreignness. Foreignness means that your company is perceived to be an overseas company, not a local company. In fact, Pepsi's been quite good about giving the impression that in each of the market it operates in, it's the local manufacturer, it's the local company, while Coke is always seen as a global entity and foreign company. General Motors Holden did the same in Australia, while Toyota and Ford were not seen as Australian companies. They were seen as foreign companies. General Motors Holden was seen as a local company. Now, obviously, General Motors is now gone, but that's the type of thing that I'm talking about. So, if you're a foreign company, you need to be able to overcome cultural, administrative, geographical, and economic challenges of operating in a country that you are not familiar with. So, how do you do those things? Well, there are several ways that you can do those things, but we're only going to deal with a couple of them quite quickly. The reason we're only going to deal with a couple of them is because this is a strategy course. If this was an international business course, we'd be spending weeks on the political, economic, cultural environment and trade and economic development policies, the legal context, but we're not doing that. We're just going to mention a couple of those. Cultural difference is sometimes exaggerated because we see an emerging global culture, but people do things differently in different countries. People do have different expectations. Administrative differences arise from being unfamiliar with where you are operating in. Geographical different distances relate to coordination, though that coordination and geographical distance has been reduced by the use of technology and the change in the way air travel works, for example. We don't have to communicate after 6 months on a boat. We can be almost anywhere in the world. Well, maybe not just at the moment, in 24 hours. And different economies have different demographics. They have different levels of development. They have different, everything that we discussed in the general environment in week 2 can in fact influence the nature of the operations in a country. And you in fact may have a whole set of history of the way that processes and factors and linkages and networks have arisen that you have to enter and create because you're the foreign company entering the new market. That's sometimes seen as a reason why firms buy an existing company, because they're trying to link within that market position. Though, of course, we have other firms that just spend a long time establishing their presence. I think I've said before that Hisense, the television and electronics company, was naming Hisense Arena for a long time before it even started operating in Australia, selling to the consumer market. They wanted to have that naming right so their brand would be seen as if they were a well-established foreign company that had been operating in Australia for a long time. Secondly, Even though global strategies are often written about, and even though those global strategies do tend to be easy to identify, frequently global strategies are in a narrow area often of standardized commodity type products or some areas of consumer electronics. And even in consumer electronics, there are variations in the nature of the product that is being sold. So global strategies are not as prevalent as they were in the past. And the rise of technology also makes it easier to have mass customization, something we talked about when we're talking about business level strategy. So firms, and secondly, because of the rise of globalization, we also have seen the rise of regionalisation, where particular countries in either geographic or linguistic proximity with each other tend to be perceived as a regional operation. Southeast Asian operations, North American operations, South American, European operations. So you get regional administration, regional management rather than global management. And when we go back, even though to look at the work of Rugman, even though there was some creativity in the way he described the world, moving from having a triad to a four region model of the world showed that predominantly firms were still operating with a significant proportion of their income related to one region. So they always had a dominant region, whether it was the US, whether it was Asia, whether it was Southern Hemisphere, whether it was Europe. So regionalisation also is reflected by the fact that between countries we're seeing an increase in understanding across borders. There's some merging, or there's some congruence occurring between the political, the legal and the social norms as cultures evolve because of the greater level of exposure people have to different cultures. Now, I know that we could also say that if we look at some of the recent political upheavals and the America First movement that Donald Trump is pushing forward, that we've seen also the breakdown of some of those regional relationships. But arguably, nationalism doesn't necessarily break down regionalism. It just creates new sets of regionalism. It's easier to coordinate and share resources within a trade area or in a geographical area than it is to do it globally. Most firms enter regional markets sequentially and they become more familiar with one market and move into another market, even if they're global firms. I mean, Disney Plus launched in English-speaking countries first because there was some synergy in doing that. Netflix rolled out their partnerships in a regional way in their South American partnerships, their English-speaking language partnerships, and their predominantly German-led partnerships, German and French-led partnerships in Europe. They've done, and they're not actually partnerships, they're just the engagement with their supply chain and the way they've marketed is built in those regional expansions. So they do have a regional focus, and we're going to show something on the entry into the Indian market of Netflix as part of an example. In our examples of global entry, which we're going to talk about as well, we're going to leave you with some examples of why McDonald's flopped in Vietnam, how Lenovo became China's first global company, why Tim Hortons is a Canadian coffee chain that also owns Burger King and one of the chicken chains in America, why it's had difficulty expanding its Tim Hortons brand within America. And we're also going to show you a video from that talks about, from an African perspective, from an American who is currently teaching in Rwanda, showing global marketing within those countries. I may also add the Forever 21 video as well that talks about their decline as examples. Why have I jumped to there? I want to come back to that as well, but I wanted to give you a little bit of a preview of what Objective 5 is. because those videos relate equally to objective 3, 4 and 5, and I just wanted to flag them with you so you knew what was coming. So, objective 5. How do firms enter international markets? There are 5 key ways that firms enter international markets. They enter through exporting, either direct exporting or indirect exporting. Direct exporting is when you're selling something to via an agent or directly to consumers overseas. Indirect exporting is when you're manufacturing a component of something that is in or providing a service to a customer or a client that then uses that to produce their product or service to sell overseas. Strategic alliances, joint ventures, is one form of strategic alliance which involves funding, involve finances, but strategic alliances can be comprehensive across a whole organisation or narrow. Acquisitions and wholly owned subsidiaries. Acquisitions are when you buy an existing company to enter another market, and a wholly owned subsidiaries is when you set up your own complete standalone business in that country, in a foreign country. Those things vary by risk and reward. As you increase the investment, increase the cost, increase the complexity of those forms of market entry from exporting up to wholly owned subsidiary, you also increase the control. So you increase your risk, but you also can increase your control. Firms sometimes change the nature of their engagement. Hyundai began as an exporter via the Bond Group and then changed when Alan Bond went broke to be an exporter into Australia using Stage and Carriage, which is a Singapore-based company that operates car dealerships and operates multiple car dealerships. It's called something else now in Australia. I think it may be SMA. But over time, they realised that they need to actually do their own marketing and their in Australia and their own marketing globally, and actually have wholly owned subsidiaries in each country, so that they would get the prominence over the effort the agent would put in for Hyundai, as distinct from Kia, as distinct from Toyota, as distinct from all the other brands that Coach and Carriage sold through its dealerships. So let's look at each of these and just define them quickly. Exporting occurs when a firm sends products it produces in its domestic market to international markets. Minimal expense, small operations of the whole host country. You may just use an agent. You may have some small office there. Often involving contractual agreements. Has high transportation costs, but that is high transportation cost is not always an issue in depending on the nature of the product. You're risking tariffs being imposed on your product because you're not manufacturing or within the country that you're exporting to or within a free trade agreement that country is part of. Of course, you may be part of the same free trade agreement. And there's little control over the marketing and distribution because you're one step away from it. You're selling the product to an agent or to an organisation that will then sell your product. Licensing is when the foreign company purchases the right to manufacture or sell the products. Can in fact be a system as well, like a fast food system or distribution system. Payroll systems are sold in Australia, or HR franchises. You pay a royalty to the licensor for each unit sold. You take higher risk. The licensee, the person paying for the license, taking the higher risk, and they probably need to invest in manufacturing or some other investment if it's not a manufactured good. It may be a service. It may be a system. A strategic alliance is when you have a partner from an international firm that collaborates with you in market entry. You share the risk and resources. That facilitates that you both develop core competencies. You learn from them, they learn from you. It requires fewer resources, so it reduces cost of entry. But There's issues of whether or not the partner is compatible with you. You can get conflict or lack of trust. You can also find that what you're doing is you're developing a future competitor because you're engaged in sharing your information with that competitor, your systems, your knowledge of the market. And it's also difficult to manage, particularly with firms that come from ethnocentric countries like the US, where they believe things should be done their way and don't work well with others. Cross-border acquisitions allows quick access to market because you're purchasing an existing company, but that's operating in a foreign market, but you can have integration difficulties. You may pay too much. It can be complex to negotiate, and there may be transaction requirements and legal restrictions that delay that process occurring. And finally, a greenfield venture is the simplest but most costly method of entry. And by simplest, I mean it's in fact a transaction, but the transaction may in fact require complex approvals and licensing to enable you to enter a new country. You need to go from the ground up to create your new business, your new factory, your new system. You may require licensing and control issues. There may be regulatory issues hurdles that you have to pass over. But it carries the highest risk, but it has the highest potential returns because it gives you maximum control, and you are the only organisation that will benefit from the success. But you take the risk for failure as well. If you have intellectual property rights, and that you're trying to enter a country where those rights are not well protected, it's probably better to enter as a wholly owned subsidiary. If the number of firms is accelerating and growing rapidly, you may want to be a standalone firm. And if you have high need to global integrate your operations domestically and around the world together, having full control makes that easier. Acquisitions and greenfield ventures are used to secure a strong and sometimes rapid presence in the international market, but of course, acquisitions are often quicker than greenfield entry. So what's our best solution? In the situation when the firm has no foreign manufacturing or service provision expertise, the best solution is exporting, because it's the lowest risk and you're relying on the things you already do well, your own core competencies, and let someone else's core competencies deal with the international market. If you need to facilitate product improvements necessary to enter a foreign market, changing the product or changing the service or changing your understanding of the foreign customer, licensing may be the best solution. If you need to connect with an experienced partner already in the target market, a strategic alliance. So you see that overlaps a little bit with the point of I described then in licensing, but it builds and builds. If you need to reduce risk through sharing costs with others, a strategic alliance works best. If you are facing uncertain situations in an emerging economy, again, a strategic alliance works best. If the firm must act quickly to gain rapid access, you want to get into the market quickly to offset other competitors entering the market so you have first mover or second mover advantage, or you need to be in a market so that you've got so that you're there and you'd want to beat other international competitors, acquire something that already exists, you won't have to build something from the base. If you have intellectual property rights that need to be protected, or the industry is growing fast with lots of firms, or you need global integration, a wholly owned subsidiary is best. Okay, so that's objective 4 and 5. As I said, there's some videos that will flow from this for you to watch before moving on to objectives 6 and 7.